So good morning, everybody. My name is John Sherry. I'm actually a substitute here today. Richard Beckwith did a lot of the work that underlies this paper. I was peripherally involved in much of it, but just wanted to sort of set that up, that I'm a sub, and I'm sorry you get second best here today. I'm at Intel Labs. Richard and I are both part of a group comprised of social scientists. So I'm an anthropologist by training. Richard's a psychologist. We have cognitive scientists, a lawyer, some technologists and designers. So our job is to sort of explore kind of new uses of technology for Intel from a kind of human-centered point of view. So that is the approach we've been taking and thinking about with respect to groups of people and data. And I want to actually start the paper off by problematizing the very first sentence of our own paper, which is smart cities run on data. I think there's as we think about smart cities, some kind of underlying assumptions. Wilf and I were just discussing this before the session started about sort of smart cities that are potentially problematic. One of them is, that the city is somehow like a computer, that smart cities, if they can just be if you can just get enough data, you can kind of program all these functions and services in a way that where everything just works, and that approach is sort of ignores the messiness and craziness of sort of urban life as it's actually lived. And there's a really nice paper in a journal called Places Journal that addresses that issue. Second problem is that so much of discussion of big data treats data as a commodity that needs to be somehow hoarded and aggregated at all costs, and that's where the value derives. I think treating data as a commodity creates all kinds of problems, not just in terms of sort of the bits versus atoms problem of thinking about commodities, but just with that general attitude of sort of wanting to hoard data. And then finally, I think a lot of the sort of literature and discourse on smart cities really focuses in on sort of what kinds of services can large organizations, whether that's municipalities or big service providers, sort of provide to citizens, which kind of overemphasizes the large institutions sort of collecting and using the data, rather than thinking about it in a more distributed sort of community access kind of way. So in this paper, I really want to just talk about how important communities are and what it means for communities to access data by actually offering 3 examples. We're all set in terms of, were you here with an adapter? Okay. Yeah. And just to sort of illustrate how thinking about communities sort of leads in some different directions. And I want to do that with 3 quick examples. So the first one is in the community, in a community of farmers in the Ringarooma Water District, which is in the Australian state of Tasmania. And in fact, it's in the kind of northeast corner of that state. Is a watershed that is the Ringarooma watershed. And this was about 4 or 5 years ago or so, was in the midst of a prolonged drought. And one of the things that was happening to these farmers was the threat by the Australian national government to regulate their water usage. And so, these are just a few pictures of sort of what things were like. The streams were way down. The farmers were facing this issue of essentially having their allotments of water being taken away from them by a national government that didn't really understand the local situation. And what these farmers realized is actually, no, we do have enough water, but what we have to do is work together to make sure that we're managing and more importantly, reporting on our water use in a way that makes the national government more comfortable. So I don't know, anybody who's familiar with water rights issues know they can be extremely divisive, and there's this kind of of attitude of use it or lose it with water, and it often pits people with water rights who are neighbors against each other because, for reasons of kind of hoarding. And so this group of farmers worked with University of Tasmania and an organization called Cicero and each other, most importantly, and created this network of sensors that allowed them to sort of understand at a much finer grained level of detail what was happening in their watershed. And it allowed them to do things like when a public resource was running low, and it was a resource that was being monitored by the national government, these farmers could allow some water to pass through to fill this reservoir so that the national government would be more comfortable with sort of where the water levels were. The national government was really worried about, I should say, about this downstream estuary that they were trying to manage. And so these farmers actually were collectively monitoring their own watershed in a way that was just really unique and unusual. And certainly the technology played a big role in it. They all had the, the ability to kind of see what was happening, not just with their own water access, with their own streams, but with those of other farmers. And so, one would think that would create a situation where there's a lot of sort of vulnerability and risk. And in fact, it did create, these farmers had to sort of get outside their own comfort zone and share this data in a way that wasn't normally done. The result was the ability to actually manage their own water. The national government wound up not stepping in to sort of impose these water use controls on them. Actually, a lot of other things resulted out of it too, including some really interesting technology that I don't have time to talk about in terms of just this collective sensing and watershed sort of reporting capabilities that are going on. But the interesting thing that sort of also happened there was that the national government saw that interesting data and said, oh, we want to have access to that. And it actually became a little bit of a fight between the farmers and the national government about whether the national government, so there were multiple data sources. There were the sort of the state and national level stream flow sensors and water level sensors and other things, water level reports that were available. But there were also these farmers, individuals, their own sort of self-tracking that they were doing about water usage, and the federal government started getting really interested in using that information. And that in itself became kind of a negotiation. It's like, should the government have access to this information? And it became, essentially was resolved by the farmers saying, okay, we'll grant you access to this data, but you have to promise sort of not to use, not to sort of come back and punish us for sharing that information with us. And maybe one of the ways we can arrange for that is by continuing to manage the watershed ourselves rather than having these outside controls put in on it. So it became this negotiation about sort of who has access to the data, who has control over the local resources, and that's a pattern that we're kind of seeing over and over with communities and data. So the second example I want to talk about is in a suburb of Chicago, a community called Midlothian. The little red circle down in the lower center is kind of where it is in relationship to the city of Chicago. Here's zooming in a little bit. The problem here was this community, about 10 years ago or more maybe, suddenly was experiencing floods in the community every time there was a major storm, and nobody really understood what was going on. And the people had, very little information about why are our streets suddenly flooding. And these were like pretty serious floods. So every time there was a major thunderstorm or something that would come through, and it wasn't the same houses every time. It wasn't always the same sort of waterways that were flooding, but it was fairly consistent. And you can sort of see here just some of the, it made the local news, and this was a particularly disturbing one. There's a couple of local kids from the neighborhood out playing in the water that, was like rushing down into these cul-de-sacs and, into these gullies. And so really a pretty serious situation. So what happened here, again, it was local community members that just decided, they were kind of waiting on the authorities, whether that was their local municipal government or FEMA or whoever to actually do something about this. Nobody was really doing much about it, so they took it upon themselves to figure out sort of what was going on here. And one of the things they did was work with this organization called the Center for Neighborhood Technology, based out of Chicago, that sort of provides technology support to communities to do for all kinds of things, air quality and food deserts and everything else. But in this case, it was about measuring water flow. And they basically provided people with a network to do self-reporting about when flooding is occurring on their property. And so what that just gave them was just a better sort of, again, a map with sort of better spatial fidelity about sort of where flooding is happening and when. And so they were able to start to build up over time these maps of sort of how and when flooding happens, also based on better localized data about where storms, where rainfall is actually occurring. And so as a result of this, they were able to kind of do two things. One was to get better prediction about where floods might occur and to provide sort of early warning systems to people about, okay, this weather pattern has hit this part, this community south and west of us. These neighborhoods, these very specific neighborhoods are likely to be affected. The other thing it actually helped them do was, so these are just some of the community members as they were organizing, this some of the mapping they were doing. The other thing that this innovation helped them do is actually pinpoint what was causing this flooding, and it turned out it was new construction on a major kind of rec center place that was in the next community over that didn't have appropriate drainage. It wasn't draining to sort of appropriate pooling, and so they had big runoff problems that were completely man-made. But the twist on this one, just like the last one, is that after the community had gotten together and created all this data and actually figured out a way to solve the problem, so they were able to work with the construction firm who had built this recreation center and figured out an abatement solution with them. And so the flooding has actually decreased. But one of the things that's happened is, in working with the Army Corps of Engineers, in trying to work with FEMA, they created this data set that actually, then these outside agencies, in particular FEMA, wanted to list these communities as being in a floodplain. And, with the obvious detrimental effects on things like home values. And so by creating this data, these people actually put themselves at risk with outside organizations who wanted to take the data and do things with it that they weren't, A, weren't comfortable with, and B, weren't actually merited in the first place. So it's another case where the data both have these great effects for the community, but the potential sort of risks to the community as well. And the third example I want to talk about is just right across the river here, industrial airborne emissions from ESCO. It was a steel fabrication. How many of you are actually Portlanders? Okay, so I don't know if you remember this story, but this is over just in in Northwest Portland, across the river. There was a community that was it's a very nice part of Portland, right? This is kind of the Pearl District north to about 25th Avenue, west to about 25th Avenue, up into the hills. And it's densely populated, beautiful homes, very active area in terms of kind of restaurants and shops and that kind of stuff. And more densely sort of occupied than many parts of Portland. At the north end of this was this steel fabrication facility, steel foundry, that was emitting a lot of toxics into the air, including particulate matter and chemical pollutants. And so it was the same thing here. There was a group of locals who finally said, enough is enough. We got to figure out what to do about this. The problem was they were also not able to get great data about it. So as one of the things I meant to show you here is that, here the red circle on the left is where the neighborhood is. The only sort of EPA air quality monitor for the city really is deeper in southeast Portland, so across the river and quite a ways away. when the weather gets nice here in Portland, the wind often shifts and blows from north to south. So that's when the conditions were worst in that neighborhood. And that would also be the time when having a air quality sensor that's south and east of the affected neighborhood would be completely ineffective at sort of measuring, what the real effects were. So one of the things that we did with this community is provide a what we call the air quality egg, which is basically just, small, inexpensive air quality sensors housed in this sort of ugly-looking, mousy, eggy thing that people could put on their own property and get, essentially, it was the same solution as the previous two, better spatial resolution on sort of what actually the pollutants were. In this case, we were looking primarily at particulate matter of a certain size, and to get sort of better real-time data about what was going on with air quality in the neighborhood. And as a result, the community was able to sort of show these negative effects of this foundry on their air quality. They were able to get readings that were, sort of hard to argue with, and wound up actually persuading the company to put in better filters to reduce its emissions. The foundry has since closed for other reasons, so their air quality has improved. But I think it was a great example of sort of how the community action and community-driven data gathering was able to sort of create change again in their community. This one didn't really have as much of a sort of long-term. The other two had these interesting issues where then outsiders wanted to come in and get their hands on this data and use it for purposes that the community wasn't comfortable with. It wasn't quite the same in this case. Nobody has really done that. What has happened, though, in all three of these cases that I meant to emphasize is that some of the technical innovations that were used by these communities have gone on to become commercially viable products. The air quality egg is one that is still out there. You can find people. It's an open source project. And the same with the Rain Ready system in Chicago and the Ringarooma water sensors are all still sort of viable projects from a technology point of view. So I think thinking about communities actually does have, it's a great way of thinking about new technologies from a commercial point of view as well. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that communities really often have the most compelling reasons to gather data. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting with the discussions of big data and now with AI, they're very often about what can one sort of entity, usually a large firm or organization with the wherewithal to sort of put all this technology in place, what can they do for a broad array of people? It's almost a reverse of kind of a broadcast model, not really a network model of value creation. I think when we start thinking about communities, we do get back to kind of more of a network model of value creation that to me is more long-term sustainable. Communities clearly need more and better tools to do this kind of thing. And the other, I think, big takeaway is that communities, they're not markets, they're not governments. The way they approach data creation and sharing is not about sort of how to monetize that data, or not really even about sort of transactional relationships. It's really about participation. The people who were sort of making things happen in each one of these communities were people who sort of made commitments to each other, who had to trust each other, and who had to sort of participate in an ongoing way. I think those are all really interesting insights for thinking about creating platforms that enable community-level participation in data creation. So I think the other kind of interesting thing is that it gets us to rethink the notion of data as a commodity. I think if we think about data as a form of participation, there's certainly a lot of anthropological literature out there on kind of alternatives to the transactional model of commodity exchange in terms of things like managing common property resources. Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, actually did a lot of excellent work on thinking about common property regimes and how communities come together to manage a common resource, and it has a lot more to do with social capital than with financial capital. I think there are things like gift economies that anthropologists have talked about how when I present you with what looks like a material commodity, it's as much about our relationship as it is about transfer of ownership. So, and then, all kinds of literature on social capital. I think some of these are really interesting sort of veins to mine in terms of thinking about the creation of value in communities that really get us away from thinking about data as a commodity. A few potential lessons here, or a few potential ideas for, and most of these I've sort of already alluded to. I just think there's really interesting opportunities, and talking to Wilf it sounds like, his organization is already pursuing some of these, so maybe way ahead of us. But, it's not just about sort of open data or data marketplaces. I think we really need to think about creating platforms where there's not an entity in the middle who gets privileged access to all the data that's created. I think we need to think in terms of more federated models where there are rights and obligations associated with the creation and access of data that sort of equally apply to everyone, and that all community members have control over, not just sort of a privileged entity in the middle. And that it maybe boils down a lot of what these say into kind of a basic point. And with that, I'll leave off there and open for questions. Fair enough. We're maybe back ahead of schedule a little bit. No, yeah, go ahead.
I had something for you and I've lost it now. I'll come back.
Okay. Thank you.
Along those
lines,
yeah.
I
just want to go back to the question we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the privacy issue, and I'm sorry I didn't sit through the whole thing, but so I'm sort of stuttering a little here. I don't know what parts of it you covered, but how do you see addressing the privacy issue with a lot of this?
I think privacy is a special case of a much broader set of obligations and rights associated with the sharing and creation of data. And so, and those really do have to be worked through in great detail. And I think, so for an individual, it's about privacy, but really it is a special case of what is it about myself that I want to reveal, and to whom. And so, to you, there may be plenty of things I want you to know, and to somebody I don't know as well or don't trust as much, there may be plenty of things I don't. So what we're really talking about is sort of what rights am I granting to others. And so I think when you start to think about it that way, there's plenty of other rights and obligations that would come with a community, sort of a broad, decentralized approach to community data sharing and data creation, including things like, stuff that you and I were talking about, but I actually want to echo up here is who is who in the community is making sort of valid and useful contributions to the rest of the community, and sort of how do we reward that kind of behavior? Who is making detrimental sort of, contributions to the community, and how do we limit, disincentivize that kind of behavior? But plus, I think, who brings what sets of skills, and what sorts of access should we allow that individual or entity on the basis of the kind of skills they're bringing sort of to the party. And so I think it gets quite complex quite quickly, but communities are complex things. I think that if you can find ways of, and this is a really tricky piece that I understand that, essentially if you can find ways of more formally encoding what people have done for eons in terms of social capital, in terms of who do I trust and why, who do I feel is a sort of valuable member of this community and why. If you can find ways of sort of making that a little bit more explicit in this sort of federated data share, I think those issues like privacy, it's not that they take care of themselves, but they become handled in ways that a lot of other issues are also handled. Yeah.
So around the safeguarding the data, what about tax on the data collection system? Is that anything that communities are worried about now, or even paying attention to?
It's a good question. Can you?
Well, I mean, there'd be a lot of incentive for an unscrupulous manufacturer to go in and change the air quality information, right?
Yeah. Okay.
There'd be incentive for nation states to go in and change public information that's being used to control
right.
industry.
Yeah. So I think that would be, so who would impose the tax on whom in that case?
A tax, as in, not a tax on, but a tax on.
A tax on, okay, yeah, ATTACKS, yeah, okay, yeah, oh, I think that's an absolute huge issue, right? It's these unauthorized access and use are the biggest threats, yeah. Oh, for sure. Yes, absolutely. You know, I think and it's not even necessarily in the form of an explicit attack, right? It's not just a question of data security. So for instance, with the Midlothian and the Chicago communities, you know, the fact that because the community had sought out FEMA's help, FEMA now had access to that flood data and, you know, way more powerful institution than the community, and had the ability to basically destroy the wealth that these people had built in their own homes, that it put them hugely at risk. So by all means, I think attacks are, again, they're, you know, certainly data security is not something that really entered into these people's thinking, partly because they weren't really very technical, but clearly the threats that outside institutions could do harm to them with their data was very much, yeah, that's a huge issue.
I was going to ask, in your examples, you know, in each case you said, you know, the community members arrived at the, you know, sense that they weren't comfortable with where these outside entities wanted to, you know, do something with their data.
Right.
When and how did they recognize that, and where did, you know, how did they come to that conclusion? How did the farmers say, hey, you know, I'm not sure we should, you know?
It was, in each case, it was pretty early on that they recognized, in some ways, there was a twin set of discomforts. One was the data that's being made available to us is inadequate for what we want to do. And the other side was, okay, if we go collect this ourselves, it could put us at risk. And they kind of knew that right from the outset, but they also knew the benefits of doing that, at least in the near term, could outweigh the risks. So, you know, for the Ringarooma farmers, it was, we want that greater, that greater sort of fidelity of data would actually enable us to continue to manage. Yes, it provides potentially the national government with more visibility into what we're doing, but if we can manage things properly, maybe we can keep them off our backs. So
Even before they collected it,
they were kind of aware of the risks. And, you know, that was the thing I think in each of these cases is like, you know, these were not people coming from technical backgrounds by any stretch. They were working with people that had technical savvy, but they were all really savvy about the politics of data and information and how, you know, how information is power and can provide outside entities with power over them, that they, you know, they were pretty open-eyed about it.
So how do you see, I mean, I think it's a really interesting issue because you can pull in both ways, right? The community, delivering flood insurance to the community, clearly, even if the government doesn't have the right to that information, who does it? Certainly the insurance companies who support them should have access to that information. So there is a power shift that comes when information is known.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem also with that one is really interesting because the, you know, what FEMA wanted to do was encode information that actually was rendered obsolete by the intervention that the community had taken. And so, you know, declaring this neighborhood a flood zone was actually inaccurate because they were able to solve the problem. Yeah, that's right.
Take another one that I know you've looked at and Richard's looked at in the city of Portland, which was air quality data.
Right, yeah.
So I buy a house, and then somebody comes along and puts air sensors up, and turns out that there's cobalt in the air around
Right.
my house.
Yeah,
Now my house value changes because if that's known,
That's right.
the information gets out.
that's right.
So there's a transition point here. Have you thought about how to deal with that kind of data? Or, I mean, I'm not sure there's a solution, but I just wanted to know if you...
I think it's a really interesting one, right? We've debated that particular one a lot in our, you know, just at the office because there is, real estate in many ways has always functioned on sort of imbalances in distribution of knowledge, right? And in incentives. I mean, if you read Freakonomics, right, there's the whole thing about the incentives of agents versus customers and all the rest. But yeah, when you start talking about being more open with sort of knowledge about what's happening in a neighborhood, it can cut both ways, and it can help communities solve the problems, but it will inevitably put them at risk, and then there is kind of an ethical issue associated with it. Is it ethical for a homeowner to withhold that information from a potential buyer? Certainly it's unethical to withhold information about, let's say, a pending, development that's going in behind your property that the real estate agent, that the seller knows about and the buyer doesn't. There have been lawsuits over those kinds of things. And I think similar things could arise. In some ways they're probably not answerable from a purely technological point of view. There are sort of ethical and policy implications as well. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, good questions. Yeah.